In July 1948, a 55-year-old economist sat down in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Under oath, he denied that he had ever passed a single document to Soviet intelligence. 3 days later, he was dead of a heart attack in a farmhouse in New Hampshire. The FBI still had an open file with his name at the top of it. His name was Harry Dexter White, and here is the part almost nobody remembers. 4 years earlier, at a resort called Bretton Woods, this same man had just finished building the financial system that would let the United States run the post-war world. The dollar as the anchor of global trade, the IMF, the World Bank. The architecture every economy on Earth still operates inside. The most consequential American economic mind of the 20th century may also have been working for Moscow. Both of those things are true. Neither one cancels the other out. That should be where this story gets complicated. It isn't, actually, because White is only one name on a list. Roosevelt did not turn a collapsing, isolationist, depression-scarred country into the most powerful nation in human history by himself. He did it with a small group of men most Americans have never been asked to name. A Wall Street lawyer running the War Department, a college dropout running the largest supply operation ever assembled, a Treasury Secretary who wanted to turn Germany into a farm, a general who never fired a shot but built the machine that won the war anyway. 6 men, 1 title, advisor, and almost none of them got to keep their reputations clean. By the time this story ends, you'll understand why a war hero refused a promotion, why a Treasury Secretary's plan to punish Germany nearly destroyed his career instead, why the man who ran Lend-Lease died with almost nothing in the bank, why the man who built Bretton Woods went to his grave under federal investigation. This is the hidden chapter of American power, not the battles, the advisors. Nobody was ever fully cleared. Nobody was ever fully convicted. Keep that sentence in your head. It's going to matter 3 more times before this is over. Now, to understand why this network mattered at all, you have to understand how weak America actually was in 1940. The United States Army, in 1939, ranked 9th in the world in size, smaller than Portugal's. Franklin Roosevelt was president of a country that had spent a decade in economic freefall, a country whose peacetime draft law passed the House of Representatives by a single vote. A country with an official policy, written into law, of staying out of foreign wars entirely. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s made it a crime for American ships to carry arms to belligerents. Isolationism was not a fringe position. It was the mainstream, backed by senators, newspapers, and a majority of the public. Roosevelt understood something his own government did not yet accept, that Britain's survival and America's survival were, in the end, the same problem. But he had no legal way to say so out loud. So instead of asking Congress for war, he built something stranger, a network of men empowered to move money, material, and diplomacy around the edges of neutrality law. It moved fast enough that Congress would be presented with results before it had time to object. The centerpiece of that network was a man named Harry Hopkins, and the way Roosevelt actually deployed him tells you everything about how this operation worked. Hopkins had run the Works Progress Administration. He was chronically ill. He'd had most of his stomach removed for cancer. By 1941, he was living in a bedroom in the White House itself, the Lincoln bedroom, because he was functionally too sick and too essential to go home. Roosevelt sent this dying man to London in January 1941, before Lend-Lease had even passed Congress. His job was to sit across from Winston Churchill and answer one question. Could Britain be trusted with American money and material, or was it going to collapse anyway? Hopkins wrote back that Churchill was the one and only person who mattered in the British government, and that London would fight to the end. That single report shaped how billions of dollars in aid got structured for the next 4 years. This is the pattern you'll see again and again in this story. Not generals winning battles, civilians, lawyers, economists, ex-social workers making judgment calls that reshaped continents with almost no oversight and almost no public visibility. Consider the man Roosevelt put in charge of the War Department itself, Henry Stimson. Stimson was 72 years old when he took the job in 1940, a Republican, brought into a Democratic cabinet specifically because Roosevelt wanted bipartisan cover for rearmament. Stimson had been Secretary of War once before, under Taft, 3 decades earlier. He kept a diary almost every day of his tenure, and that diary is now one of the most valuable primary sources historians have for the entire war. In it, Stimson wrote plainly about decisions most officials would never put on paper. That included, later in the war, his private unease about the target selection for the atomic bomb. He personally had Kyoto removed from the target list, arguing the city's cultural and historic significance made it the wrong place to demonstrate American power. That is a bureaucrat in his 70s, overriding a military targeting committee on a matter that would define how the war's final chapter was remembered. Not through force, through a note in a file. But the person actually running the largest logistics operation in human history, bigger by dollar volume than anything the world had built before, was not a general either. It was Hopkins again, this time as head of the Lend-Lease program starting in 1941. Lend-Lease ultimately moved more than $50 billion in weapons, food, and material to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and dozens of other allied nations. Translated into today's economy, that figure runs into the hundreds of billions. Hopkins ran this from a hospital bed as often as from an office. Contemporaries described him as looking, by 1944, less like a man than like a ghost with a briefcase. He never took a salary increase. He was, by every account, indifferent to money. When he died in January 1946, less than a year after the war ended, he left an estate worth barely more than his life insurance policy. The man who had personally authorized more spending than most nations' entire GDP died with almost nothing in the bank. Now, here's what makes this even more disturbing. The same government that could move $50 billion overseas on Hopkins's signature had simultaneously a Treasury Secretary quietly designing a peace plan of a very different character. It was so punitive it would later be compared to the same catastrophic logic that produced the Nazi movement in the first place. Henry Morgenthau Jr. had been Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary since 1934, a Hudson Valley neighbor and one of the president's oldest personal friends. By 1944, with Allied victory looking near certain, Morgenthau began drafting what became known as the Morgenthau Plan. It was a proposal to strip Germany of its heavy industry entirely and flood its mines. The plan's own language called for converting the country into a pastoral state, an agrarian nation incapable of ever rebuilding a war machine. Morgenthau brought the plan to the Quebec Conference in September 1944 and, extraordinarily, got both Roosevelt and Churchill to initial it. And then it collapsed almost as fast as it had been approved. Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Secretary of War Stimson both fought it bitterly. They argued that deindustrializing Germany would leave 40 million people with no way to feed themselves, and would hand post-war Europe directly to Soviet influence by default. Details of the plan leaked to the press within weeks. Some historians believe the leak came from inside Stimson's own department. Republican newspapers used it to paint Roosevelt as vindictive just as he was fighting his fourth presidential campaign. By early 1945, the plan was dead in every practical sense. The same government that had drawn it up quietly reversed course toward rebuilding, not dismantling, the German economy. Morgenthau's reward for one of the most consequential policy fights of the war was quiet exclusion. Truman asked for his resignation within months of taking office in 1945, not out of malice, out of political convenience. The man who had helped finance an entire world war through treasury bond drives was simply no longer useful to the men who came after Roosevelt. Now, the officer actually organizing this war on paper, General George the 100th. Marshall never commanded a single division in combat, not in the First World War, not in the Second. He spent the entire conflict in Washington as Army Chief of Staff. He built an army from under 200,000 men to more than 8 million. He coordinated Allied strategy with real intensity. Churchill himself, in a phrase that has survived in multiple wartime accounts, called him something close to the true organizer of victory. Now, when Roosevelt considered giving Marshall command of the D-Day invasion, the single most prestigious combat assignment of the war, Marshall refused to lobby for it. He told the president he would accept whatever decision served the country best. Roosevelt gave the command to Eisenhower instead, reportedly telling Marshall he could not sleep at night with Marshall out of Washington. Marshall accepted this without public complaint. He had built the machine. He let someone else drive it into history, and said almost nothing about it for the rest of his life. And so the war ground forward on the labor of men the public barely knew existed, until the alliance holding it together started to buckle from the inside. By 1943, cracks had opened between Washington and Moscow that had nothing to do with battlefield strategy and everything to do with information control. Roosevelt's own diplomatic channel to Stalin ran partly through Sumner Welles at the State Department. It ran partly through informal backchannels Hopkins maintained personally. Both channels were operating with only partial knowledge of what the other was promising the Soviets. This is not speculation. It's the documented structure of how Lend-Lease aid to the USSR was actually negotiated, department by department. Overlapping and occasionally contradicting American representatives made commitments Moscow later held Washington to. Take Sumner Welles himself, Roosevelt's Under-Secretary of State, and by most accounts the second most powerful man in American diplomacy through the early war years. Welles ran the back-channel talks that shaped how far Roosevelt would go to keep Stalin inside the alliance, negotiating post-war boundary questions years before Yalta made them public. The mechanism was simple and almost entirely informal. Welles bypassed his own boss, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and reported straight to Roosevelt because Roosevelt trusted his judgment over Hull's caution. That worked for a while so well that by 1943 Welles had more direct influence over Soviet policy than the man who technically outranked him. Then, in that same year, rivals inside the State Department, chiefly Hull, who resented being sidelined, made their move. They resurfaced a years-old allegation involving Welles's personal conduct on a train in 1940 and used it to force Roosevelt into a choice. Roosevelt chose Hull. Welles resigned in September 1943, at the exact moment his backchannel expertise was most needed. The diplomatic apparatus he'd built was folded back into a State Department that had just spent a year trying to destroy him. Not because he lost the trust of the Soviets, because he lost an internal Washington turf war to the man he'd spent 3 years quietly outmaneuvering. Into this same gap, an administration running foreign policy through personal channels instead of formal ones, stepped Harry Dexter White. And this is where the story's real complication begins. White was a Treasury economist, not a household name even then, but by 1944 he had become the chief American architect of the post-war financial order. At the Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944, 44 Allied nations gathered at a resort in New Hampshire. There, White effectively outnegotiated the legendary British economist John Maynard Keynes over what currency would anchor the post-war world. Keynes proposed a new global reserve currency, something neutral, something not tied to any single nation. White pushed instead for the US dollar itself, backed by gold, to become that anchor. White won. The result was the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and a dollar-centered financial order that, 80 years later, still prices the majority of global trade. It still backs the reserves of nearly every central bank on Earth. In other words, the reason the dollar in your wallet has the power it has today traces directly back to one negotiating position. One Treasury economist in a hotel ballroom in 1944. That should be where Harry Dexter White's story ends. The quiet genius who built the money system the free world still runs on. It isn't. Let me say that again because it matters. The man who built the financial architecture of American global power spent the entire period doing something else on the side, allegedly. According to intercepted Soviet cable traffic, decrypted years later under the codename Venona, he was passing information to Soviet intelligence contacts. Former Communist Party members Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley both named White directly to federal investigators as a Soviet source as early as 1945 and 1948. White denied every accusation under oath before Hawk in August 1948. He testified, in his own words, that his life had been guided by a devotion to American democratic ideals, not by any foreign loyalty. 3 days after that testimony, he was dead of a heart attack at his farm. The mechanism, as Bentley described it to investigators, was almost mundane. Routine briefing memos, budget projections, and Treasury position papers. This was the kind of paperwork White generated by the hundreds every month anyway, allegedly funneled through a courier network instead of staying inside government channels. One of the specific charges was that White had passed details of a plate engraving plan for occupation currency. That would have been genuinely damaging intelligence, since it would have told Moscow exactly how much control it could exert over defeated Germany's economy. The judgment on White, even from historians sympathetic to him, is rarely kinder than reckless. He was a man convinced his own economic vision was obviously correct. Sharing it, even with a wartime ally turning adversary, could not possibly cause harm, or so he seems to have believed. And the impunity hit is the strangest part of this entire story. Nobody was ever charged. Truman's administration was warned about White before appointing him to the IMF's founding managing director post in 1946. It promoted him anyway. Then it quietly let him resign a year later, once the political heat became unmanageable. No trial, no conviction, just a farmhouse, a subpoena, and a heart that gave out on schedule. And White wasn't the only reputation this administration had to manage through rumor and denial. During the same stretch of the war, a fabricated quotation, tax and tax, spend and spend, elect and elect, began circulating in Republican newspapers. It was attributed, at various points, to Hopkins or to Roosevelt's own advisors. The line was supposed to prove the New Deal brain trust saw government spending as a permanent political weapon, not emergency relief. No credible transcript or document has ever surfaced showing Hopkins said any version of that line about himself. Historians who have traced the myth generally point instead to a 1930s aide of a different Democratic official as the likely originator. It got reattached to Hopkins decades later for maximum damage. Here's the number that made it stick anyway. By 1944, the WPA and its successor programs had moved through roughly $11 billion in Depression-era relief spending. That figure was large enough that a fake soundbite calling it cynical political engineering felt entirely believable to a skeptical public. The judgment from Hopkins's own defenders was blunt. The myth survived not because it was true, but because a dying, physically frail bureaucrat made an easy villain, one who couldn't fight back in the press. The impunity hit lands on the rumor itself. To this day, some version of that fake quote still circulates online, attributed to Hopkins, entirely unsourced, outliving every retraction ever printed. Now here's what makes White's case different from Wells's, or from the fake quote about Hopkins. This one never actually closed. The Venona decrypts weren't declassified by the National Security Agency until 1995, nearly 50 years after White died. They appear to corroborate at least some contact between White and Soviet intelligence channels. But historians still argue, seriously, over how much of it was calculated cooperation versus naive overconfidence in his own judgment. As recently as 2024, IMF historian James Botton has continued to argue the case is murkier than the Chambers-Bentley version suggests. White, in this reading, may have been sharing information he believed served both countries' interests at a moment when the USSR was still a wartime ally, not yet an adversary. We are not going to resolve that argument here. Nobody has. Nobody was ever fully cleared. Nobody was ever fully convicted. That is, itself, the point. We are all, every single one of us, still living inside the financial system this possibly compromised economist built in 6 weeks in 1944. Every time a central bank in Brazil, Nigeria, or Vietnam holds dollars in reserve instead of its own currency, that is White's negotiating table, still setting the terms. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn this into a simple story about hidden traders running American policy. That is not what the record actually shows. For every White, there is a Marshall who refused personal glory for institutional discipline, a Hopkins who worked himself into an early grave without ever taking a cut for himself, a Stimson who quietly saved a city from atomic destruction with a note in a file nobody was required to honor. The advisors who built American power were not a conspiracy. They were something messier and honestly more American than that. A handful of imperfect, overworked, occasionally compromised men making enormous decisions under enormous pressure. Some of them happened to be right for history and wrong for their own careers. Sometimes both at once, in the same man, in the same conference room. Now, here's the through line that connects a hotel ballroom in 1944 to your bank account today. Bretton Woods didn't end when the war did. In 1948, the same institutional logic White had built got scaled up into the Marshall Plan. George Marshall, by then Secretary of State, put his own name on a 16-nation, $13 billion reconstruction program. It was built for a Europe that Morgenthau, 4 years earlier, had wanted to leave in ruins. The irony writes itself. The plan that actually rebuilt Germany was designed by the same general who'd refused to seek glory commanding troops. It was executed through the same dollar-based system White had just finished engineering. It replaced the deindustrialization plan Morgenthau had gotten Roosevelt and Churchill to sign. Marshall received the Nobel Peace Prize for it in 1953. He remains the only career soldier in the prize's history to win it primarily for a peacetime reconstruction program, not for ending a war. The judgment underneath that irony is simple. The man who refused to fight for his own glory ended up with the one honor none of the generals who did fight ever received. By the time Eisenhower left office in 1961, he used his farewell address to warn the country. He named the danger directly, an unwarranted influence, sought or unsought, by a permanent military-industrial complex. Remember, this was a former general who had personally benefited from Marshall's self-sacrifice, warning the country about the machine that self-sacrifice helped build. By 1961, annual U.S. defense spending had settled at roughly 9% of the entire national economy, a peacetime figure with no precedent in American history before Marshall's wartime mobilization set the template. That is, the direct descendant of the 8-million-man army Marshall built from scratch in Washington. He never fired a shot. And the machine he built without firing one eventually needed a 5-star general turned president to publicly warn the country about it. And what followed was decades of the dollar-centered system absorbing every shock thrown at it. In 1971, Richard Nixon severed the dollar's last formal link to gold, the Nixon shock. The system White built didn't collapse, it adapted. The dollar stayed the world's reserve currency anyway, on reputation and inertia alone, even after the gold backing that had justified White's original pitch to Keynes simply vanished. In 1991, the Soviet Union, the country White may or may not have been quietly serving, collapsed. The American-led financial order absorbed its former satellite states into the same system built at Bretton Woods 47 years earlier, without writing a single new founding rule. 2 decades after that, in 2008, the global financial crisis tested the Bretton Woods institution's successors directly. The IMF, White's own creation, extended more than $75 billion in emergency lending to stabilize economies from Iceland to Pakistan. The authority for it traced straight back to the charter White negotiated in that New Hampshire ballroom. And today, in an era of sanctions regimes, swift restrictions, and countries actively trying to de-dollarize their trade, the fight is still going. Structurally, it's the same fight White won in 1944. As of 2026, the dollar still accounts for the clear majority of global reserve holdings and cross-border trade invoicing. Nobody has built a system that has replaced it yet. So here is the actual thesis of this story, restated the way it was always meant to land. American superpower status was not manufactured on a battlefield. It was manufactured in hospital rooms, hotel ballrooms, and treasury offices by men whose names most of us were never taught. A dying social worker who moved $50 billion without ever taking a raise, a man in his 70s who saved a city with a diary entry, a general who refused glory so someone else could have it, an economist who built the modern financial world while under federal suspicion of serving a foreign power. Nobody was ever fully cleared. Nobody was ever fully convicted. They simply built the machine, and the machine outlived every argument about who they really were. If you've ever wondered why the dollar in your pocket carries the weight it does, here's the answer. Or why the military-industrial complex is a phrase every American recognizes, even if they can't name who coined it. You've been living inside a decision 6 overworked advisors made in rooms most of us have never heard of. That's not ancient history. That's the operating system underneath the news you read this morning. If that surprised you even a little, it's worth sitting with why these 6 names never made it into the version of this story you were taught in school. Consider subscribing if you want more of the hidden architecture behind the headlines. Not as a demand, just an invitation to keep pulling this thread with us. And here's a question worth sitting with in the comments. If the men who built American power were this compromised, this human, this ordinary, what does that tell you about the people building the next version of it? Right now, in rooms we still can't see into, because the next chapter of this story isn't about Roosevelt's advisors at all. It's about the one man Truman brought in to clean up White's mess and what he did instead.